The swamp doesn't care about you. That's the first thing you learn if you live long enough to learn anything at all. The bayou doesn't care if you're hungry or lost or afraid. The water doesn't rise or fall based on your feelings. The alligators don't know your name. The mosquitoes will find you whether you're a saint or a sinner, and the mud will swallow your boots either way. The swamp is the most honest place on earth because it has no opinion about you whatsoever. And once you make peace with that, once you stop expecting the world to notice you, you can start to see what the swamp actually is. The most alive, most generous, most astonishing place you'll ever set foot in. My name is Calla Thibodeau, and I was 16 years old when I inherited an island that nobody could reach in a swamp that nobody wanted to cross. This is the story of how I got there, what I found, and why the same people who said I'd be dead within a month were lining up in pirogues at the edge of the bayou 10 years later, begging me for what only that island could provide. It was September of 1943, and the letter came to the Baton Rouge Home for Girls on a Tuesday. The letter said that my grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Odile Thibodeau, whom I had been told was dead, had actually been alive this whole time, living alone on an island deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, and had now, at the age of 81, genuinely died. She had left everything to me. The letter was from a notary in Breaux Bridge, and it described the property as approximately 4 acres of habitable high ground surrounded by permanent swamp, accessible only by watercraft, located roughly 9 miles from the nearest road. The matron at the home, a stiff woman named Mrs. Arsenault, read the letter twice and then looked at me as if I'd played a trick on her. "Your grandmother was alive?" she said. "Apparently. Living in the Atchafalaya? Apparently. On an island? 4 acres. Mrs. Arsenault folded the letter and placed it on her desk and said, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 20 years managing other people's unwanted children, "Calla, you cannot live on an island in the middle of a swamp. You are a 16-year-old girl. You will drown or starve or be eaten by something. This is Louisiana. Things eat you here." She was not wrong about Louisiana. She was wrong about me. I didn't argue with her. I didn't argue with the girls who whispered about it in the dormitory that night, or with the nun who told me to pray about it, or with the notary in Breaux Bridge who drove me to the edge of the basin 2 weeks later and pointed into the trees and said, "It's in there. About 9 miles. I've never been." If you want to find out what was growing on that island, and why an entire bayou community came to depend on a 16-year-old girl who lived in the one place they were all afraid to go, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what my grandmother built on that island wasn't just a home. It was a pharmacy that grew from the mud. A Cajun trapper named Nonk Guidry took me in, not into his home, into his pirogue. Nonk was 67 years old, lean as a heron, brown as the water he'd spent his life on. He had known my grandmother. He was, as far as I could tell, the only person in the basin who had visited her island regularly, bringing supplies and taking away whatever she gave him in return, which, I would learn, was medicine. "Your grand-mère was a traiteuse," Nonk told me as he pulled us through the cypress swamp, the water black and still around us, the trees rising from it like columns in a drowned cathedral. A healer, the old kind. She knew every plant in this basin, what it cured, what it poisoned, how to prepare it. People came to her when the doctors couldn't help, when the doctors wouldn't help, when there was no money for doctors at all. Why did my mother tell me she was dead? Nonk was quiet for a while, poling around a fallen cypress trunk, where a cottonmouth lay coiled like a black rope. Your mother wanted a different life. City life. She thought if you knew about Odile, you'd end up in the swamp too. He glanced back at me. She wasn't wrong. The journey took 4 hours. 4 hours of water and trees and silence so deep it had texture. Not empty silence, but full silence, layered with the calls of herons and the splash of garfish and the constant whispering conversation of wind in Spanish moss. The swamp was not a wasteland. It was a world most people drove past at 60 miles an hour on the highway and never thought about again. The island appeared as a low hump of green rising above the waterline, subtle, easy to miss, surrounded by a margin of floating duckweed and water hyacinth that made the boundary between land and water uncertain. But as Nonk pulled us closer and the pirogue's bow slid onto solid ground, I saw that the island was more than a hump. It was a garden. My grandmother had planted it, every inch. The high ground, maybe 3 of the 4 acres, was covered in a dense, organized profusion of plants that I couldn't identify, but that I could smell. The air was thick with fragrance, sharp, sweet, bitter, green, floral, medicinal. It smelled like a kitchen and a pharmacy and a church all at once. Paths wound between the plantings, narrow, well-tended, bordered by logs and shells. Raised beds made from cypress planks held smaller plants in organized rows. Trellises of cane supported climbing vines. And at the center of the island, in a clearing shaded by 3 enormous live oaks draped in moss so heavy it nearly touched the ground, was the cabin. It was built on pilings, raised 4 feet above the ground against flooding, with a cypress plank floor, a tin roof, a screened porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and a chimney made of shell concrete that the basin people call tabby. It was small, but perfect. The home of someone who understood that in the swamp, you don't fight the water, you live above it. Inside, the cabin was my grandmother's life laid open like a book. 1 room served as kitchen and living space. A second room, smaller, was her bedroom. And the third room, the largest, taking up nearly half the cabin, was her workshop. The workshop stopped me cold. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, and on them were jars. Hundreds of jars, glass, ceramic, tin, each one labeled in my grandmother's handwriting, in a mixture of French, English, and what I would later learn was a Cajun Creole patois, used by the traiteur for plant names that had no translation. The labels read like poetry from another world. Sassafras root, for thinning the blood, elderberry tincture, for winter fever, buttonbush bark, for pain of the teeth, lizard's tail, for swelling and inflammation, spider lily bulb, poison, for external use only, swamp milkweed, for warts and skin growths, blue flag iris root, for congestion of the chest. There were dried bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, sage, rosemary, lemongrass, something that smelled like camphor, something that smelled like licorice, something that smelled like nothing I'd ever encountered, sharp and green and alive. There were mortars and pestles of various sizes, cheesecloth for straining, bottles of alcohol for tinctures, beeswax and lard for salves, a copper still, small, beautiful, clearly handmade, for distilling essential oils. And on the workshop table, as if she'd left it open for me to find, was a notebook, thick as a Bible, bound in leather that had been oiled against the humidity. On the first page, the medicine book of Odile Thibodeau, Traiteuse of the Atchafalaya, begun 1899. These are the plants and their uses. Learn them. Respect them. They will keep you alive, and they will keep others alive. That is the bargain. My grandmother had spent 44 years documenting every medicinal plant in the Atchafalaya Basin, 412 entries. Each one described the plant, where it grew, when to harvest it, how to prepare it, what it treated, and, critically, what could go wrong. Dosages, contraindications, warnings. This was not folk superstition. This was pharmacology, built from observation and practice over half a century, written by a woman who had never seen the inside of a university, but who had healed more people than most doctors in Bro Bridge. The first months taught me that the swamp was not trying to kill me. It was trying to feed me. I had expected starvation. What I found was abundance, if you knew where to look and what to take. The bayou around the island was teeming with life: catfish, crawfish, bass, bream, garfish, frogs. The island itself provided what the water didn't: pecans from a tree my grandmother had planted decades ago, figs from a bush near the cabin, persimmons in autumn, muscadine grapes that hung from the live oaks in purple clusters. The garden, once I learned to identify what was growing, contained herbs and vegetables woven together in a system that looked wild but was carefully designed. Tomatoes climbing through elderberry bushes, peppers shaded by sassafras, sweet potatoes spreading beneath the raised beds of medicinal plants. My grandmother had created a food forest, not a garden in rows, but an ecosystem, layered, diverse, self-sustaining. The tall trees provided shade for the medium plants. The medium plants sheltered the ground covers, and the ground covers held the soil against the rain. Everything fed everything else. Nothing was wasted. I learned to navigate the pirogue, Nonk's gift, along with a paddle, and the advice to stay low and don't argue with the current. The first week, I fell in twice. The bayou water was warm and dark and tasted of tannin and decaying leaves, and both times I came up sputtering with mud in my hair and my pride in worse condition than my clothes. By the second week, I could pole a straight line. By the month's end, I could read the channels, which ones led to open water, which ones narrowed into dead ends choked with hyacinth, which ones had current beneath their stillness, and which ones were truly stagnant. I learned to read the water's color. Brown meant moving, green meant stagnant, black meant deep. I learned the sounds: the hollow knock of a woodpecker on cypress, the prehistoric grunt of a bull alligator in mating season, the delicate splash of a gar rolling at the surface. I learned to coexist with the alligators, who were less interested in me than I was in them, and with the snakes, who wanted only to be left alone, and with the mosquitoes, who wanted my blood and got it generously until I learned my grandmother's secret: a salve of citronella and pennyroyal oil that she had made for 40 years, and that worked better than anything the army had. And every evening, by lamplight on the screened porch, while the swamp chorus of frogs and insects rose around the island like a living wall of sound, I read my grandmother's notebook. Page by page, entry by entry, learning the plants the way you learn a language, slowly at first, then with gathering fluency, until the swamp around me stopped being a confusion of green and became a vocabulary. That vine was passion flower, for anxiety and sleeplessness. That shrub was yaupon holly. Its leaves brewed into tea were a stimulant the coastal tribes had used for centuries. That moss hanging from the cypress, not Spanish moss but a different species, ball moss, had antifungal properties when prepared as a poultice. The island was a living pharmacy. My grandmother had spent 40 years cultivating it, transplanting wild species from across the basin, selecting the strongest specimens, creating growing conditions that maximized potency. The raised beds of her most important medicines were positioned precisely. The plants that needed full sun on the island's south side, the shade lovers under the live oaks, the moisture-dependent species at the island's edges where the ground stayed permanently damp. The first person who came for medicine was a woman named Lisette Broussard. She arrived at the island's edge in a pirogue in December, pulled by her teenage son, carrying an infant with a cough so deep it sounded like the baby was trying to breathe through gravel. Lisette was thin and exhausted, and her eyes had the flat look of a mother who has been awake for 3 days, listening to her child struggle for air. Nonk Guidry said the tratus's granddaughter was here, she said. He said you might have medicine. I didn't know what I was doing. I want to be honest about that. I was 16 years old. I had been reading a notebook for 3 months, and the idea that I could treat a sick infant was terrifying. But I had read the entries on chest congestion and croup and infant respiratory illness, and my grandmother's instructions were precise. I made a steam treatment from elderberry and eucalyptus. I prepared a chest poultice from camphor leaves and rendered lard. I brewed a weak tea of mullein, a plant my grandmother noted was safe for the youngest children in small doses, and showed Lisette how to give it with a spoon. The baby's cough eased by morning. Not cured. I wasn't a miracle worker, but eased enough that the child could breathe and sleep and nurse. Lisette wept. She tried to pay me. I refused. Your grandmother never charged the ones who couldn't pay, Nonk told me later. She had a rule. If they come by pirogue, they can't afford a doctor. The medicine is free. I adopted the rule. It became the foundation of everything that followed. Word spread through the basin the way everything spreads in the bayou, slowly, carried on water and whispered conversation at the fish landings and the dance halls and the church steps after Sunday Mass. A trapper with an infected hand came in January. I cleaned the wound, packed it with a poultice of plantain leaf and raw honey, and it healed in a week. A pregnant woman with swelling in her legs came in February. I gave her a tea of dandelion root and nettle that reduced the swelling overnight. A child with a rash that wouldn't heal. An old man with joint pain so bad he couldn't pole his pirogue. A woman with headaches that blinded her every month. A fisherman who'd been stung by a ray and whose foot had swollen to twice its size. They came to the island one by one, poling through channels that most people avoided, following directions that Nonk had given them or that they'd gotten from someone who'd gotten them from someone else. And I treated them one by one, consulting my grandmother's notebook like scripture, learning by doing, making mistakes that I corrected, and discoveries that I recorded in my own notebook. A companion volume to Odil's, written in the same mixture of French and English and patois, because some plants have names that only sound right in the language of the people who first used them. By the end of my first year, I had treated 43 people. Not all successfully. Some conditions were beyond what herbal medicine could address, and I learned quickly to recognize when someone needed a hospital and not a tea. But most of them left the island better than they'd arrived, and that was enough to make me, at 17, the tratus of the Atchafalaya. Nonk Guidry died in the spring of 1946 at 70. He died on the water, his pirogue found drifting in a channel near the island, his body slumped forward as if he'd fallen asleep mid-stroke. I buried him on the island under the largest live oak, and I planted rosemary on his grave because my grandmother's notebook said rosemary was for remembrance, and because Nonk was the kind of man the world forgets too quickly. Quiet, generous, essential. By then, I had expanded my grandmother's garden significantly. I had spent 2 years exploring the basin by pirogue, mapping the locations of wild medicinal plants and transplanting specimens to the island. I had identified 67 species that my grandmother hadn't documented, plants she might have known but hadn't recorded, or plants that had migrated into the basin since her notebook was written. I added them to my own records, tested them carefully, on myself first, always, and incorporated them into my practice. I had also discovered something about the island that my grandmother's notebook only hinted at. The soil. The island's high ground was built on a shell midden, an ancient mound of discarded shells accumulated by indigenous people over centuries, possibly millennia. The decomposed shells had created a soil uniquely rich in calcium and minerals, with a pH level that was alkaline compared to the surrounding acidic swamp. This alkaline soil, combined with the island's elevation above the permanent waterline, created growing conditions that were found almost nowhere else in the basin. Plants that struggled in the acidic swamp soil thrived on the island. Certain medicinal species, particularly those in the mint family and the nightshade family, produced compounds of extraordinary potency when grown in this soil, far exceeding the strength of the same species grown elsewhere. My grandmother had known this intuitively. She had chosen this island, or the island had chosen her, because the medicine it produced was stronger than medicine from anywhere else. The traus and the island were a system, each one essential to the other. The polio summer of 1948 was when the island became essential to the entire basin. Polio hit Louisiana hard that year. The cities had hospitals, overwhelmed, desperate, but functional. The bayou had nothing. When children in the basin communities started falling sick, the fever, the stiffness, the terrible progression toward paralysis, there was no doctor within practical reach. The nearest hospital was in Lafayette, 2 hours by car from the nearest road, and the nearest road was 9 miles of swamp from the basin communities. I couldn't cure polio. I want to be clear about that. Nobody could, not in 1948. But I could treat the symptoms, the fever, the pain, the muscle spasms, the secondary infections that killed as many children as the virus itself. My grandmother's notebook had entries on fever reduction, pain management, and respiratory support that I had been refining for 5 years. I prepared batches of fever-reducing tea, willow bark, and elderflower, the same compounds that aspirin is synthesized from. I made poultices for muscle pain. I brewed respiratory treatments for children whose chest muscles were weakening, and I went to them. I didn't wait on the island for the sick to come to me. A traus who waits for patients while children are dying is not a traus at all. I loaded my pirogue with medicine, jars and bottles and bundles of dried herbs packed in cypress boxes that Remy had built to keep them dry, and I poled 9 miles through the swamp to the communities along the basin's edge. 9 miles of black water and cypress knees and channels so narrow the Spanish moss brushed my shoulders. And I went house to house, cabin to cabin, houseboat to houseboat, treating children and comforting mothers and doing everything I knew how to do with plants that grew on a 4-acre island in the middle of a swamp. I slept in my pirogue between visits, tied to a cypress root, the medicine boxes stacked around me like a fortress. I ate nothing for 2 days because there wasn't time. I poled until my arms burned, and then I poled more, because somewhere ahead, there was another child with a fever and another mother with terror in her eyes. And the only thing standing between that child and the worst was a girl in a boat with a jar of willow bark tea. 14 children in the basin contracted polio that summer. 3 died, and those 3 haunt me still. Their names carved into my memory, the way Nonk's name is carved into the live oak. But 11 survived. The parish doctor, who eventually reached the basin in September, told the families that the herbal treatments I'd provided particularly the respiratory support and the fever management, had likely prevented several of those children from developing the most severe form of the disease. "Who taught you this?" he asked me, standing on the dock at Bro Bridge, looking at the jars of tincture I'd brought for his examination. "My grandmother," I said, "and the swamp." He shook his head. "This isn't folk medicine. This is medicine. Some of these preparations are as effective as anything in my bag." "Where did she learn this?" "From her mother, and her mother's mother, and the basin." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Would you be willing to teach?" I married in 1950. His name was Remy Landry, a fisherman from Henderson, who had first come to the island with a dislocated shoulder and had come back every week afterward with fish and crawfish and the quiet, steady company of a man who was comfortable with silence and water, and a woman who smelled like camphor and elderberry. He courted me the Cajun way, slowly, respectfully, with food. He brought me redfish he'd caught that morning. Crawfish boiled with cayenne and corn. Boudin his mother made from a recipe she wouldn't share with anyone, not even me, though she relented after the wedding. Remy understood the island the way Nonk had understood the water, not scientifically but bodily, with a respect born from a lifetime of living alongside things that could kill you and choosing, every day, to coexist instead. He never questioned what I did. He never called it folk medicine or superstition or women's work. He called it what it was: healing. And he supported it with everything he had. Remy built us a larger cabin, still on pilings, still cypress, but with a proper workshop twice the size of my grandmother's and a screened room where patients could rest overnight when they were too sick to make the journey home. He built a dock on the island's south side where 3 pirogues could tie up at once. He cleared a wider channel through the Hyacinth so visitors could reach us more easily, and he never once suggested we leave. We had 3 children on that island. They grew up bilingual in English and Cajun French, trilingual if you counted the language of plants, which they spoke before they could read. My daughter became a nurse. My older son became a botanist. My younger son stayed on the island and became a traiteur himself, the first male traiteuse in our family's history, though the word doesn't change for gender in our tradition. In 1955, Dr. Marcel Hebert, the parish doctor who had examined my preparations during the polio summer, helped me catalog my grandmother's notebook and my own additions into a formal pharmacopoeia. We documented 489 plant species, their preparations, their uses, and their observed efficacy. The document was published by the LSU School of Pharmacy as a research bulletin, and it drew the attention of pharmaceutical researchers who spent the next decade studying compounds from basin plants that my grandmother had been using for 40 years. 2 of those compounds were eventually developed into commercial medications. One, derived from a swamp plant my grandmother called simply la racine bleue, blue root, became the basis for an anti-inflammatory drug that is still prescribed today. Another, from a water lily species that grew only in the channels around the island, yielded a compound effective against certain skin infections. The pharmaceutical company offered to buy the rights to both plants. I refused. I gave them the knowledge freely, on one condition: that the people of the Atchafalaya Basin would always have access to the medicine at no cost. They agreed. Their lawyers thought I was naive. Their scientists thought I was remarkable. I didn't care about either opinion. I cared about the bargain. My grandmother's bargain. The one written on the first page of her notebook. The plants keep you alive, and you keep others alive. That's the deal. You don't sell it. You honor it. Remy died in 1976, on the water, like Nonk, his pirogue found drifting in a channel he'd fished for 26 years. I buried him on the island, next to Nonk, under the live oak. 2 watermen, side by side, in the only ground that stayed dry in a world made of water. I kept working. My hands knew the plants the way a musician knows an instrument, by touch, by smell, by the subtle difference between a leaf harvested in morning dew and one harvested in afternoon heat. I treated patients into my 70s, poling my pirogue through channels I could navigate blindfolded, carrying medicine to people who had no other source of care. I died in the spring of 1989, at 62. The swamp takes years the way it takes everything, quietly, persistently, without malice. They found me in the garden, kneeling between the raised beds, my hands dark with island soil, a basket of freshly cut elderflower beside me. My daughter said I looked like I was working. My son said I looked like I was listening to the plants the way I'd always listened to them, with my whole body, leaning in, paying attention. The island is still there. The garden still grows. My grandson tends it now. The traiteur, the 4th generation of Thibodeau healers on that 4-acre mound of shell and soil in the middle of the Atchafalaya. The pirogue traffic has slowed. Roads are closer now, doctors more accessible. But people still come. They come when the doctors can't help, or won't help, or when what they need isn't a prescription, but a cup of tea brewed from plants that have been growing on island soil for 100 years, handed to them by someone who learned from someone who learned from someone who learned from the swamp itself. On the cabin wall, burned into a cypress plank by Remy's steady hand, are the words my grandmother wrote on the first page of her medicine book. Learn them. Respect them. They will keep you alive, and they will keep others alive. That is the bargain. Below it, my children added, Calla, Thibodeau, Landry. She kept the bargain. So let me ask you something. What island are you afraid to reach? What swamp stands between you and the place where your real life is waiting? Not the swamp of water and cypress, but the swamp of doubt, of other people's warnings, of the voice that says you'll drown, you'll starve, you'll be eaten by something? Because here's what the bayou taught me. The places that nobody wants to go are the places where the most important things grow. The swamp is not a wasteland. It's a pharmacy, a garden, a cathedral, a home. It looks like nothing from the highway. It looks like everything from a pirogue. The people who warned me were not wrong about the difficulty. The swamp is difficult. The mosquitoes are real. The alligators are real. The isolation is real. But difficulty is not the same as impossibility. And the things that grow in difficult places, the medicines, the resilience, the knowledge that can only be earned by living where nobody else will, those things are worth every bite, every blister, every sleepless night spent listening to the swamp breathe. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the swamp you've been avoiding and the island waiting on the other side, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who crossed the water and found what was growing on the other shore. Your island is out there. The pirogue is ready. Start paddling.